Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Cosmic Echo, a Taylor's podcast. I'm your host today, Lee Adams, and I'm speaking with Dr. Rick Strassman, who is the author of DMT, the Spirit Molecule, as well as his newest book, which is DMT, the Soul Prophecy. In this interview, we just first discuss his first book and some of the background in that area, as well as his patients and what they experienced, and then we dive right into his newest research and newest passion, which is the relationship between the DMT experience and the prophetic state that it experienced in the Hebrew text. So it's a great interview. We go through a lot in this discussion, and hopefully you learn as much as I did from this amazing person, and he's one of my favorite people of all time. So take that in context. Anyways, without further ado, let's just get into it. Thank you, Dr. Strassman, for being on the show. And can you just give us a little bit of an introduction about yourself and how you got interested in the research that you're involved in and writing these amazing books?
Well, let's see. Well, my name's Rick Strassman, psychiatrist, writer, I guess more than a psychiatrist nowadays, but I did all the work that I'm writing about as a psychiatrist, doing research. I'm on the clinical faculty at the University of New Mexico School of Medicine right now. And I studied, psychedelic, drugs in the early 1990s, and this was the result of a long-standing interest that I had had in the biology of spiritual experience. I thought that, to the extent that psychedelics could mimic or replicate certain features of non-drug religious experience like that brought on through prayer or different types of meditation, that there must be some common underlying denominator biologically going on that was turned on in both situations. So I began focusing on DMT. The studies began in 1990 and I wrapped them up in 95. The last year of my work, I had started some dose finding work with psilocybin too. And I had permission and drug to start some LSD work, but it was just too hard doing long drug or long acting drug studies on a research ward. So we never got the LSD work off the ground.
Yeah, I mean, I became interested in your work because of specifically your focus on melatonin at the beginning. I think why melatonin and why was that an interest of yours, and then why did that bring you to researching DMT?
Well, I was led, to melatonin because of my interest in the pineal gland, and I was led to the pineal gland because it seemed like it might be a part of the brain that might be, mediating these spiritual experiences, and to the extent that there was some, biological activity in the pineal that might be responsible for mystical or spiritual states, then I started to look into the biology of the pineal gland. I first learned about the pineal from a mentor at Stanford, Jim Fadiman, and this was in 1972. And there was not that much known about the pineal, especially in humans at the time. Melatonin had been discovered in the 1940s as a skin blanching agent in lizards, reptiles, amphibians. But there wasn't that much, known about its, biology in mammals. seem to be responsible for seasonal breeding in seasonal breeding animals, like sheep. Excuse me.
No,
I set the alarm to be
no
sure I was
issues.
on this time.
Appreciate it.
Yeah, but 1972 there wasn't that much known, and but still, the pineal gland itself had been revered as a potentially spiritual organ for millennia. It's the only unpaired organ in the middle of the brain. It has been it has been associated with the location of the crown chakra, the crown, Sephirah in Jewish Kabbalah as well. Um, so it seemed to be the anatomical location of deep spiritual experience. So I started to look into the pineal, somewhat in the 1970s. But I was starting medical school, and there wasn't much time to pursue kinds of interests. But in the meantime, I maintained an interest in the spiritual states, spiritual experience, and was looking for some biological counterpart. Um, and it was an interesting confluence of circumstances. I went up to Alaska after I completed my psychiatry residency. I was the psychiatrist in Fairbanks at the community mental health clinic up there. And this was in the early 1980s, which was just around when people were beginning to be interested in winter depression. And at around that time, there was some work which finally could establish in a very precise manner levels of melatonin in humans. Um, and people were relating melatonin problems with winter depression. So it was kind of a very fortuitous turn of events, because psychiatry was all of a sudden becoming interested in the pineal gland as well as melatonin. So things didn't work out that great in Alaska. I didn't like the work, and I returned to academics, um, and trained in clinical psychopharmacology research at a fellowship in La Jolla. And I learned everything I could about melatonin at the time. This was in 1982, 1983, and there was there was some indication that large doses of melatonin might be might be psychedelic. And I thought, well, if melatonin were psychedelic, then that would tie in a number of disparate threads, which was the spiritual properties of the pineal gland, as well as the biology of how that might actually occur. So my first kind of independent study was of the function of melatonin in humans, but it turned out to not be especially psychoactive. It just was sedating, which is what it is used for mostly now in in the clinic or over the counter. But in the meantime, I learned about DMT, which I proposed could be made in the pineal gland, but it had been discovered in human blood, human spinal fluid, and human lung in particular in the 1960s and the 1970s. So I dropped the melatonin work and began working on all the required paperwork and the acquiring of grant support to run the DMT study, which began in 1990.
That's amazing, man. That's a crazy turn of events that got you to that point as well. Um,
It was completely crazy from from beginning to end. It was
yeah.
crazy, but you can kind of plot it out in a stepwise manner, so it doesn't look
Yeah,
that crazy when you're in the fine detail of it.
definitely. Well, I mean, it sounds like you've always been kind of attracted towards trying to research these mystical experiences or spiritual experiences. Is there anything, particularly in you that drives you to kind of be interested in these experiences and try to research that?
Well, that's a complicated question. You know, I was, raised in kind of a crazy, abusive, household,
Hmm.
and at a young age, I learned, to dissociate. Uh, I could just, put myself in an altered state just as a means of protecting myself. So I was always interested in weird states of consciousness that didn't involve an immediate, relationship with the outside world. So I, learned to take, some solace and some comfort in inner states.
Hmm.
Um, and then when I, went to college and learned to meditate, it was like you could enter into those states, voluntarily without, resort to, needing, to be traumatized and
Right.
in order to step into them or to, you know, or to slip into them. Um, so as a result of, learning to meditate, I, learned about Buddhism and was, really impressed with their understanding of altered states of consciousness and, deconstructing them and, also utilizing them for inner peace, the greater good, one's, welfare, the welfare of the world. So it was, I think in, Buddhism, I, finally discovered a, system of thought which took altered states, seriously. And, that provided, the beginning of an intellectual scaffolding, which, provided, me the support to, look at the, drug state in a, systematic and, methodical manner as well.
Hmm. That makes sense. So I mean, you had people tend to, I think, associate psychedelic experience with like Buddhism and Tibetan Buddhism and Zen Buddhism today. Like the New Age movement is kind of directed in that way. So I know you had patients that had experiences while you were doing these DMT experiences, and I want to understand like your perspective of how that relates to um, how these spiritual experiences relate to Buddhism or don't relate to that, and how you kind of um, you started writing your newest book on prophetic states um, in a different direction.
Right. Well, that's true. If you go into any head shop, there's, Buddhas and mandalas and tankas and incense and prayer beads and, gongs and dorjes and Tibetan, mementos and things. Um, yeah. And, that has a complicated history. I think, part of it was historical. In the 1960s and the early 70s, both, psychedelics and Eastern religion, especially, Buddhism, and especially, the charismatic Buddhist, teachers coming in from Tibet and from Japan, um, came in at around the, same time as, as the entrance of, psychedelic, drugs into, the culture, especially on the West Coast, East Coast too, but especially on the West Coast. So they kind of went hand in hand. These new technologies which provided, reliable, consistent entrance into, highly altered states. So it's kind of like, well, you meditate, you take psychedelics. They kind of went hand in hand. Um, and it became, reified in a way with, the Harvard group and their interest in, Eastern religion. It's interesting. The two main researchers at Harvard, or even the three, main ones, Tim Leary, Richard Alpert and Ralph Metzner. Tim was a lapsed, Catholic, and Alpert was a lapsed Jew, and Ralph Metzner was a lapsed, Lutheran. So they all went there. They all kind of, went into, the Eastern, religious mode as a, way of, number one, explaining what the altered states were, or how to understand them. But also, I think, neurotically, it was an escape from their past. They kind of spurned their upbringing and, wanted to rebel against, who they were as, younger adults. But at the same time, there is a lot of, there's a lot of overlap between the experiences that one has on psychedelics and the reports of the phenomenology when you meditate, and also, some of the insights that you might attain when you're on psychedelics comport with those that are reported, or form the intellectual underpinnings of the Eastern religions. I think especially, the constructed, sense, or the constructed nature of reality and its ability to be deconstructed are emphasized both in the, psychedelic state and also the meditative, traditions. And, lots of people became interested in Eastern religions as a result of their drug experiences. When I was at the Zen monastery that I trained at and studied under, I would say, 90%, maybe even more, of the young monks, had their first, glimpse of the potential for an enlightened state under the influence of LSD. And, some describe that glimpse, which is called, bodhicitta, the glimpse of enlightenment, or the, thought of enlightenment, or the, seed of enlightenment, as the most important stage in one's Buddhist, training, because it is a flash of lightning, as it were, that, that illuminates things in a way that hadn't been illuminated before. And, then it's up to you, to pursue it, to the extent that you're interested, or opportunities are, possible, to, dig into it deeper. But just as importantly, which isn't really discussed, anywhere, near as much as this, psychedelic and, Buddhist connection, are all of the people who became, Jesus freaks after they, took acid in the, 60s and the 70s. And, the, Jewish, folks who began studying Kabbalah, or became, rabbis, or started, to hang out in the more ecstatic, Jewish streams, which, developed alongside the, psychedelic, Buddhist ones. So there was, I think, as much a, turning to Christianity and, and, to Judaism, but it just didn't, attract the same kind of interest as, the Buddhist, connection did. Buddhism is exotic, and everything exotic still, has a lot, more of an appeal than, the tried and true, which, or, what you come from anyway.
Right. That makes sense.
Your own background.
Yeah. The idea of a rebellious, or like, that resonates with me as well, because I came from a Christian background. So when I started to explore these altered states, it definitely attracted towards the Eastern philosophies versus, like, the Western views or something like that. That would be probably more culturally acceptable, and probably an act of rebellion in that sense as well.
Right. Well, it's kind of interesting with my returning to my Jewish roots and being interested in the Jewish mystical. Well, it isn't a mystical experience, but fundamental, Jewish religious experience, which is prophecy. I'm kind of being put into that category as, rebellious and like a rabble rouser, because I don't subscribe to the non-dual state as the ultimate experience that one, can attain either through, drugs or, through spiritual, practices. And I was led to the Jewish stream, or led back to it as a result of the DMT study, because I had been studying Zen Buddhism, practicing it for a long time, about 20 years or so, and that was the model that I brought to bear spiritually on the DMT research. I was expecting people to have a white light, mystical, unitive experience where there's, where there wasn't any ego, no sense of self. One, was kind of absorbed uh, or unified with the ground of being. There were no, thoughts, no images, no consciousness. The kind of, the scripture of great, wisdom kind of, list of, non, and non.
Yeah.
Well, that's a good one. Non, non and on. That could be a new 12-step, group for those who are stuck in non-duality. But in any event, the kinds of experiences that my volunteers, had were not anything like that. Which was, kind of ironic. Before I began the study, I interviewed as many people as I could about their experiences on DMT, so I would, be ready for what I was going to hear, and also to, develop a preliminary, rating scale that, people could, fill out afterwards, so I could quantify the state as best as possible. And everybody described interactive, dual experience, that, there were, things in the DMT state that one related to, and that it was, very rare, if ever, to, merge with, the one. And my volunteers were expecting merging with the one, because most of them were meditating or had some kind of, practice that emphasized those kinds of states as, the ultimate. So I was too. I was expecting it as well. So everybody was, surprised. I mean, I, shouldn't have been surprised, but I was, just because I was so, fixated on the, Zen Kensho model. And most of the volunteers were too, but the experiences were much more interactive and relational, as opposed to, mystical and unitive. So that, kind of speaks to an issue that I haven't talked about all that much, previously. I'm, kind of on a rampage against the mystical unitive model, as kind of, this soul, model.
Right.
That is, an intrinsic part of the psychedelic experience. You give, psilocybin, for example, or you give LSD, you give, 5-methoxy DMT, and the intrinsic character of the drug is entheogenic. It isn't, psychedelic anymore. It's it's divine. It's godly. It's spiritual. So I was, very keen on that question. I mean, that was the main impetus for my research in the first place. Was, are these drugs, are these, drugs intrinsically, pharmacologically spiritual? Like, if you, give the drug, hands off, bare bones, here's the drug, tell me, what happened. Will you, have a mystical experience? Will you have a kensho, a, Buddhist enlightenment effect? And the answer was no, which I've touted repeatedly. But as I've gone back and thought about the experiences that the volunteers had in the setting of no preparation at all. They were not prepared, other than it was fast, it was short, and you might think you've died, but don't worry, because first of all, nobody's ever died on DMT, and if you get into any physical problems, you're in a hospital, there's a crash cart outside, we can call the code team, and you'll be in good hands. um but that was the only preparation that we gave people. We didn't spend hours and hours educating them about the nature of the mystical experience, how to attain it when you're in that altered state, how to interpret it in that way as a mystical unitive experience. There was just no coaching. So without any coaching, without any indoctrination, without any expectation being built up that this is the kind of experience that you need to have, that you will have, and everything is geared towards having that experience. Instead, people had the experience that was most um, appropriate for who they were. Like, for example, in the nearly 5 dozen volunteers in our study, only one had what might be called a classical religious or spiritual mystical experience. And he was somebody who was a religious studies major in college and had been seeking that kind of state his whole life, and he had it. Somebody else was a nurse that was very keen on the near death state. She read book after book after book, was very interested in a near death state, and she had a near death experience, the only classical one in our study. Wow. Somebody else was an urban shaman, and he always wanted to have a shamanic death rebirth experience of being dismembered, going to the underworld, being reconstituted, creating the universe in his in his mind once more. And lo and behold, this guy had that kind of an experience. Somebody else was kind of Eastern European background, kind of nihilistic, Kafka kind of, what's the point? And he just had those kinds of experiences on DMT and psilocybin as well. So I think those cases prove the value of the term psychedelic, that their mind disclosing, their mind manifesting. And one of the ways in which you could contemporize that expression is using the notion of placebo, or even thinking of psychedelics as super placebos, that your beliefs become experiences, your wishes and your thoughts become experiences. So instead of only wishing for a near death state and thinking about near death states and valuing them and wanting to have one, with a strong psychedelic experience, you have that experience. You enter into the near death state. If you're a shaman and you want that kind of a shamanic death rebirth scenario, then you have that experience. And by using the term placebo, it isn't make believe, it isn't imaginary, but it's the making real and certain and objective in a way, because it's an objective experience. You those things which are more or less conscious, that are your goals and your aspirations, become real. They become true and real and as certain as anything has ever been in your life. So it it's it's an interesting way of looking at the drug effect as opposed to well, like for example too, uh, one case I like to bring up often is that of of Charles Manson and his followers. Uh, they were disaffected, violent, sociopaths. Um, but also they were kind of lost, and they found in Charles Manson a very charismatic guy. And they took LSD together, and Manson would give them this rap about helter skelter, that if they killed enough people and blamed the blacks, then there'd be a race war. The blacks would win, and then Manson and his followers would then become the rulers of the black victors of the helter skelter war. And he gave these people LSD, went on and on about helter skelter, and he turned these people into serial killers. Because they were convinced that okay, helter skelter is coming about, and they're the chosen ones who are going to implement it. To catalyze it. So it depends on where you're coming from and what you want to be ultimately, as a human being, as a person. So nobody in Manson's group became a monk, and
Right.
nobody in these mystical experience studies becomes a serial killer. It's who you are and who you want to be and what you want to get out of the drug experience. So Manson's, followers, had these inchoate ideas about, you know, they were being, wronged. They never got the credit or the power or the money or the fame that they wanted to. So, Manson, created a crucible where those characteristics and the people and the hopes and aspirations which they had became real, certain, and true. And then they went about doing it. In the same vein, if you want a mystical experience, if you're depressed, um, if you want to improve your experience of non-duality, then take a drug in that kind of a setting with that kind of um, context, that kind of crucible, and you'll emerge more likely than not in that state. You'll be convinced of its truth. You will have experienced it yourself personally, and you'll be a changed person. So there is no question that people end up being changed.
Yeah, definitely.
It's just is it a result of the drug or the experience? And if it's a result of the experience, then what are the components of that experience? Um, so that's
That
kind of
makes
where I've been going
that makes sense.
recently.
Yeah, so
Good.
with your yeah, it totally made sense. With your newest book though, you kind of relate the experience to the Hebrew tradition as well as like the lessons in the Hebrew Bible, and it's educational in the sense that you talk a lot about why these words and concepts were created, and then you go through similarities of the experience and then dissimilarities. So I'm wondering what, if these, you described to me these experiences being pretty much determinal based on the intention that the person has, or maybe some of their background, or what they're trying to achieve. So like setting, I guess, or set. Um, and so why the Hebrew Bible? Why prophecy?
Yeah. Okay. Um, well, yeah. So why did I move into the Hebrew Bible? Well, there are a number of reasons. One is that the DMT state just wasn't consistent with what I was expecting. Using the Buddhist model. Um, it was interactive and relational. It wasn't unitive and mystical. There wasn't a white light. There were these beings in the DMT world that people uh, related to. They interacted with them. They asked questions. Things were, done to the volunteers by the beings. They were told things by the beings. Um, so that, wasn't, what I expected. So I had to kind of go back, to the drawing board with respect, to the phenomenology. Um, and also, the reality, basis, or, the, feeling of reality that people experienced under DMT was a little unexpected as well. I was thinking it would be more similar to other psychedelics, where you're on a drug.
Hmm.
You're completely out there, but you're on a drug. Uh, you know the, but what occurs with DMT is you may know you're on a drug, but you also have the strong feeling that the experience that you're having isn't really a drugged experience. It's more of an entry into another objective level of reality, which feels as real or even more real than everyday reality.
Hmm.
So that's one of the striking elements of DMT compared to the other psychedelics like LSD or psilocybin. So that wasn't consistent with my Zen background either, which treats the states on drugs or even on meditation, which aren't the formless states, as just detritus, just kind of the way station, an illusory set of way stations on the way to the real thing, which is the white light non-dual state. And everything else is considered unreal. But for my volunteers, those things were felt to be real, realer than anything. Um, so that those were the two properties of the DMT experience which weren't adequately addressed, by the Zen model. So I also, wasn't completely convinced of, the utility of the more biological or physical models as well. The psychoanalytic model also treated the experiences as if they were something else,
Hmm.
Symbolic of conflict, let's say, or repressed impulses. The psychopharmacology model clearly posits that these experiences are just hallucinations, just activation of certain receptors in the brain, which cause these experiences, as opposed to, let's say, making them possible, which was more of the conclusion I came to at the end of my DMT book, the Spirit Molecule, which suggested that the drugs allowed for the brain to receive information that resided in other levels of objective reality. But even so, once I stopped the research and started looking into some of the newer models of the universe as proposed by physics, even though dark matter, parallel universes, those kinds of notions could provide some mechanistic power, they didn't really provide the meaning power that I was looking for.
Hmm.
Like, what's the point? Why is the brain so configured? Even if even if even if this is how it works, why is the brain so configured? So I was still keen on looking in to the more religious import properties of the state. What's the state good for? Are we going to be any wiser? What can we learn from from these experiences? So I then began to, default, more to the religious, traditions, which are obviously interested in altered states, but they're interested in altered states because of what they can provide
Right.
individuals and the larger, culture. Shamanism was good in a way because it did propose, the reality nature or the reality of these altered states and their inhabitants, their contents. But shamanism is pretty dark. Stephen Beyer wrote a book called "Singing to the Plants,"
Yeah.
and he has a great line in there about shamanism. There's good shamans and there's bad shamans, but they're all bad shamans. Because if you're going to work in the shamanic world, especially for healing, it's all about warfare and cursing and anti-cursing and anti-cursing. So if you become ill in that model, it's because you've been cursed by a bad shaman. So if you're a good shaman, you remove the curse, but it's it's such a macho culture. If the curse has been removed, that pisses off the original cursing shaman, who then attacks you, and you have to and then you have to attack them back, and it just gets to be this huge mess. So even though they do propose the reality of the spirits that they invoke for healing and for cursing, it's still pretty murky. And I would hope that any religious model, obviously, the Western, religions have, got their fair, share of abuse and, horrible, um, goings on. You would at least, want, to be able to, find within the tradition some glimmer of, goodness. And, I'm at at least for me, with my primitive understanding of shamanism, that really wasn't in evidence. Um, also, being Jewish, one of the things that I found difficult, just genetically almost, with both Buddhism and shamanism, was the absence of God.
Hmm.
There's all this bowing at the monastery. Um, you bow to each other. You bow to statues. You bow to the teacher. Photographs of dead teachers, images of bodhisattvas and former teachers. But and it seemed a bit like idol worship. Like, if you're gonna bow, like, I hadn't really formulated this in my mind in my 20s and 30s and 40s, while I was studying Zen. But it still was it was still kind of niggling at me, like, well, if I'm going to bow, I should be bowing to the Most High,
Yeah.
that to the highest possible thing to bow to, rather than these lower level manifestations. And in shamanism, you invoke spirits. You don't necessarily invoke God. And if you speak to shamans, they'll kind of poo-poo as a rule the notion of a God. But
Hmm.
strictly speaking, who created these spirits? Who bestowed upon them the power to heal and to curse? So that's where I think the notion of a most high God really comes in handy. So at the same time that I was starting to root around for spiritual models for the DMT state, I was writing about the relationship between Buddhism and psychedelics, and I was adducing that there were similarities between um, the drug state and the enlightened state, or at least the state of bodhicitta, where you flash on the possibility
Hmm.
of a different way of living your life. And the monastery got pretty unhappy about that because in their mind it was publicly equating drugs and Buddhism. Uh, in our private conversations, the monks and I were all, or the monks were all gung ho, like
Mm.
this is great. I took LSD when I was younger. That's why I'm a monk now. You know, but when the discourse hit the public airwaves,
Mm.
it was much more problematic. So push came to shove, and finally it was like, well, if we can't talk about these things publicly, then there's really no point. It's hypocritical. Um, so we parted ways, and I was kind of bereft of a spiritual community and a spiritual orientation, and stumbled on a book about Judaism,
Mm.
uh, and it kind of made me think, well, I am Jewish, and I used to know Hebrew, and maybe there's something here. Um, so I began reading the Hebrew Bible, the so-called Old Testament. Retaught myself biblical Hebrew, and then just dug into it. Started with Genesis, and as time went on, I began to notice this thing called prophecy, which is the way in which one receives the information which is laid out in the Hebrew Bible. The Hebrew Bible is a prophetic book. It's a record of prophetic experience. And once I enlarged the notion of the prophetic state to encompass anything spiritual, any spiritual experiences uh, as undergone by any figure in the text. It isn't necessarily only the predictions or the foretellings of the canonical prophets like Isaiah and Ezekiel and Jeremiah, but it's any spiritual experience that is undergone by anybody in the text. It could be like a handmaiden, it could be a soldier, it could be it could be inspiration, it could be an angelic encounter, um, it can be an out of body experience. So when you expand the definition of prophecy beyond just foretelling or predicting, then the Hebrew Bible is full of prophetic experience. And once I expanded the definition to encompass a lot broader range of phenomena, then I thought, well, I wonder how similar the prophetic state is to the DMT state, because just intuitively or in a Gestalt kind of manner, it seemed as if there was a lot of overlap.
Hmm.
So I started comparing the two states phenomenologically, like are the visions similar, are the auditory effects similar, are the emotional responses similar, what about the somatic effects, palpitations or nausea or stomach churning or weakness or falling down or shaking, those kinds of things. So I binned all of the prophetic experiences into the bins that I had originally used in characterizing the DMT effect. And there is a huge overlap, like a huge phenomenological overlap. uh, like if you look at chapter 1 of Ezekiel, it's completely DMT like. There's spinning wheels, there's lightning, there's blue, there's flying through space, there's weakness, there's fear, there's falling down, there's a voice, there's rushing waters, um, which fill Ezekiel's auditory world. But at the same time, there's something missing, because obviously the records of my DMT volunteers and of all the drug experiences which have ever taken place in history have not had the same impact on Western civilization as the prophetic encounters have, which form the basis for Western civilization. It's theology, it's ethics, and it's morals. philosophy,
Hmm.
economics, politics, uh, you name it. The names of our kids are all biblical figures. Um, so I started to look more carefully at how the states differed.
Hmm.
And one of the way the states differ is the fulsomeness of the interactions. The relational quality of the prophetic encounter is much more developed, much more sophisticated, goes much deeper and much broader than that of the DMT experience or any psychedelic experiences um, in general. Um, so then it was like, okay, and I began to shift a bit, like, well, there's a new category called relatedness, which I kind of extracted by looking at what the differences were between the prophetic and the DMT states. So once I looked at the relatedness uh, characteristic or attribute or property, I then kind of stumbled on, well, what is the function of the relationship. And generally, or primarily, the function is to exchange information, to communicate. And it's and it's to communicate information, verbal information.
Hmm.
uh, so what is the nature of the verbal information in the Hebrew Bible? And it's the prophetic message,
Hmm.
which is a very complex, well articulated message, which people have been exerting themselves to understand, to summarize, to apply, for as long as the text has been around.
Definitely. Um, I know that in your book you talked about these prophetic experiences not requiring any type of drug use. I mean, a lot of theories have been proposed that people in the Bible that have had these experiences were using some type of substance, and you kind of go into a little bit of detail in the book about how that isn't required.
Yeah, people have been, looking, for, psychedelic agents that were, taken by, characters in the Bible, by, biblical figures. One of, the candidates is, marijuana and, the incense, the holy incense. Another is, specific ergot alkaloids in the manna, which the Israelites ate in the desert for 40 years. And one other possibility is DMT in the burning bush that Moses encountered, which could have been an acacia, which much there's many species of acacia which contain DMT. Some people have proposed that Jesus was a mushroom, an amanita mushroom, which is not especially psychedelic, but
Hmm.
be that as it may. um but if you look carefully at the text, there is not one mention of prophetic experience occurring through the agency of an outside substance.
Hmm.
uh, there are no descriptions of the manna being psychedelic. There's no descriptions of the incense being psychedelic, and there isn't any evidence of the burning bush being psychedelic, or or being used that way. And there are plenty of reports of psychedelic prophetic states occurring in the Bible without any mention of outside agents. Um, so the whole notion of outside agents, psychedelic substances, I think is kind of it's kind of a red herring, because if you take into account the nature of DMT, it's made in the human body. It's an endogenous substance. It's made in the lungs. It's made in the pineal gland of rodents anyway. and probably humans. It's in the blood of humans. It's in the spinal fluid of humans. It's in the urine. So you know um, the presence of DMT in the human body naturally, and the effects of exogenous DMT, I think, provide a lot more support for the for the natural activation of these states in the human without having recourse to looking under every stone and under every bush for some psychedelic substance that people were taking.
That makes sense. Yeah, I mean, through heavy breathing, things like that, obviously you can um, produce an altered state. So, do you think that maybe they were doing some type of practice through heavy breathing or dieting or something like that that could have caused these experiences, or they were just initiated spontaneously?
Well, I think both. Like Moses didn't eat and drink for 40 days and nights. Elijah was really depressed after the kind of response that his mission was getting, and stopped eating. Went off to the desert. uh, Music might stimulate prophetic experience in certain people. uh, Sleep or sexual abstinence is another possibility, or channeling of the sexual drive. But still, those techniques aren't really mentioned especially frequently in the text. Usually, and this is a striking difference between the Buddhist or the Eastern religious models generally, and the prophetic one, is that most of the time, or nearly always in the Hebrew Bible, prophecy comes unbidden. It isn't welcome. It isn't sought after. Um, it's more of a decision of God, who is going to be a prophet. If you read in the book of Exodus, when God first appears to Moses, Moses just kicks and screams and says, choose somebody else. I'm not into it. Choose my brother. He's older, he's cool, he speaks better than I do, he's more charming. Let him do it. And Jeremiah complains, bitterly of being, chosen as a prophet. So compare that, with the Buddha, who was unhappy with his lot in life. I mean, his lot in life was great, but he wasn't happy as an individual, and he went off to seek enlightenment. He did this, he did that. He found certain teachers. He hungered for enlightenment, and as a result of his strenuous exertions, attained enlightenment. So that is in striking contrast, uh, to the prophetic narrative, where usually it isn't a state which one can seek and then attain. It's interesting. The primary disciple of Jeremiah was a fellow named Baruch, and Baruch is an incredibly loyal scribe of Jeremiah. He's his apprentice. He follows him everywhere, helps him out. And at a certain point, Baruch says, I want to be a prophet. I've worked my ass off to study with Jeremiah. I've been his apprentice. Why aren't I a prophet by now? So God speaks to Jeremiah, who then speaks, to Baruch, and he says, "You're asking for too much. You're asking too much, Baruch. Be happy with your lot in life." So this isn't quite, the Eastern model. So generally there are schools of, prophecy, which are mentioned a few times. There's the school of Elijah, the school of Elisha, the school of, Samuel. But you don't ever hear of any individuals who came from those schools who became, full-fledged, prophets.
Mm.
So, by and large, you're just, chosen by God, and you can, take on the mantle or not. Beware if you don't, because life will be even, more miserable for you. But yeah. As a rule, anyway, you don't take drugs, you don't engage in spiritual, practices in order to attain to the prophetic experience. It's more like you're chosen by God. Um, you know, there's a concept that kind which devolved from Aristotle's teachings, um, which is that God does not withhold from the worthy. So if you're chosen to become a prophet, it's usually for a good reason. You're a certain kind of person. You're in the right place at the right time. God, sees that you're a worthy, vessel, for prophecy, and then you're chosen, and you're, given a specific message or a specific, task to perform. Um, so those personal characteristics encompass certain moral characteristics. You're virtuous. Let's say you're a virtuous person.
Mm.
um you've purified yourself to a certain extent. You've got the intellectual apparatus to be able to extract information from the visions and the voices in such a manner that you can communicate that information successfully and in an intelligible way.
That makes sense. So, with the DMT experience being similar to a prophetic experience in the Bible, and you already talked about the quality of these two experiences not exactly being equal. Like the DMT experience hasn't changed our culture that much, as much as the Hebrew Bible has. Um, what in the relationship, I guess, what is the point of what is your perspective of the point behind these experiences through the DMT experience, and how does that relate to the Hebrew experience? Like, how can you use that, or I guess generally, what's the point behind it?
Right. Well, that's a great question, and it could be our closing question too, because we've been on for about
Yeah,
an hour. So would
definitely.
that be all right?
Yeah, and then I'm just gonna ask you about your how people can get a hold of you and get your books and stuff.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I think DMT and other psychedelics enhance what is called the imaginative faculty. Uh, the Aristotelians divided the mind into the rational faculty, which are ideas, and the imaginative faculty, which is everything else. Uh, it includes the senses, uh, the body, the emotions. Um, so I think DMT stimulates the imagination. It makes it makes perceptible uh, things which are normally invisible, and there is information in those percepts, in those feelings, in those sensations, but it requires the intellect, or the rational faculty, to be able to extract um, usable information from them. So I think what that points to is, if you're going to make the most of the enhanced imaginative function which comes about through using psychedelics, you have to have the best developed intellect and rational, faculty that you can. And the only way of enhancing the rational or the intellectual faculty is through education. Um, so that then translates into you know what you read, what you study, what you think about. So you have to and if you look at these current studies where everybody is trained or educated or prepared to have a mystical experience, look at Manson's model where everybody is trained, educated, and indoctrinated to have another kind of experience. It's what you fill your mind with beforehand, which determines the ultimate outcome of the psychedelic state. So what uh I guess that's a roundabout way of saying you should read and study what you feel is important, what you feel is true, what you want to believe is right and certain in your life, what you want to apply, how you want to deal with the outside world and yourself as a result of your psychedelic trip.
Mm.
So if you want a mystical experience, you spend 8 hours with a therapist who prepares you for that kind of state. If you want to become a mass murderer, you spend 8 hours in a different kind of a setting. If you want to experience the prophetic state, you read the Bible. You read it, you break your head against it, you try to understand what it's saying, and then you'll get that much closer to the reality behind those ideas when you're tripping. And it's interesting. It's one of the conclusions that I came to at the end of the Spirit Molecule book, which was a little bit glib, but I think it still is true, and I'm saying it with not as much glibness as I did then. But of the three, legs of the tripod of the, drug experience, the drug and the set and the setting, the most dispensable probably is, the drug when it comes to, who you want to be as a, grown up. Who you're with and what you think about are going to be as important as a particular experience. The experience, I think, though, can cement or make more real those things that you aspire to, more or less consciously. But what you aspire to are things that you've been working on in the non-drug state: what you read, what you study, what you memorize, your behavior that you try to purify and cleanse as best you can.
That's great. And a great way to live a life is what you said, to focus on the things that are important. So it's awesome. Well, what are some ways that people can get a hold of you and get a hold of your work, learn about new research that you're involved in?
Well, I have a website, rickstrassman.com, and you can contact me through that. My email address is on there, and you can order, books, which I will, sign in and scribe, through my website. And I post, interviews or publications or blog posts on my website. I've got a couple of Facebook pages which I check in on every day or two, and you can reach me through Facebook as well. Yeah, so what I'm working on these days, which is a question which is a question I'm asked often, is a couple things. One, well, actually, I'm working on three things. One is a Bible translation for the rest of us.
Oh.
Most of the Bible translations out there are really hard to get through. Either they're fundamentalistic, either Jewish or Christian or whatever, and you just can't really swallow what they're feeding you, or they're just so complex, they're so archaeological or so form critical like, is it the, J source, the P source, the E source? Well, this isn't really what they meant to say, so let's, cross out these words and transpose those. Yeah, you'll just go, crazy, trying to understand the text through those, through those, lenses as well. So I've been, doing a translation and commentary of Genesis. Kind of slowly but steadily. I'm on chapter 14 now, out of 48, I think, chapters. I'm not sure. Yeah, so that's one thing I'm kind of working on Sundays. The main thing that I'm working on is an autobiographical novel. In 2014, I was really sick. I completed the Prophetic States book and got pneumonia, and then I got C. diff, and I was just sick as a dog for a year. But it was a remarkable year, and I knew if I lived through it, I would like to tell the story. So I took very careful notes of that whole year. So I'm writing up my notes, and hopefully I'll get that book out before the end of the year. It won't be too long, maybe 180 pages or so, but it's kind of darkly humorous. It's it's a spiritual quest, but it's kind of hard to see that through the weeds. But I'm doing my best to make it approachable and engaging. So once that's done, I want to start working on some biblical fiction of Abraham, the patriarch. Abraham's a great figure. Like, he's the first Jew. The Christians claim him as their patriarchs. The Muslims claim him as their patriarch, or one of their patriarchs. And he didn't really follow Jewish law, which was laid down by Moses hundreds of years after Abraham's death. So I think he's a great figure with respect to living a prophetic life without necessarily being stuck in a legalistic framework. So that's one thing I'd like to start, working on in earnest after this autobiographical, novel installment is done. Research-wise, anyway, I collaborate, I consult, I help, write manuscripts, I edit. I've been doing some, peer review. I just received a manuscript to peer review on microdosing, for one of the flagship psychopharmacology journals. So I'm still active doing those kinds of things. There's a group in Ann Arbor that I'm working with. That's that was the group that published the DMT in living rodent pineal gland about 5 years ago. They're working on DMT in human brain and in response to dying. So I'm kind of helping them formulate their studies. Kind of peripherally at this point. I'm not quite as current on psychopharm as I used to be, so I can lend an overview a little more than I can go into the fine details of the receptor pharmacology that I used to be more familiar with. So those are the pursuits that I'm following these days.
It sounds exciting, man, and I look forward to reading some of those books that will be coming out soon. And I appreciate everything you've done in my life. You've made a huge impact on me, and a lot of other people that I've talked to constantly refer to you as a mentor to them, even though you may have not talked to them, but they read your book and it's made changes in their life. So you've made huge impacts in this country and probably the world. So I appreciate it, man. And thanks for taking the time to spend with me and share your personal views and your passions with the listeners. So thanks.
Well, thanks, Lee. I enjoyed our chat today very much. Yeah.
This has been another episode of Cosmic Echo, a Tail Leader podcast. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to learn more about Dr. Strassman and his work, you can visit our website at tailleaders.com/CE podcast. Additionally, you can support this podcast by clicking on our donation page located at the same website. We look forward to bringing you additional episodes in the near future, but until then, happy dreaming.